The Supreme Court hears arguments on state pensions, and demonstrators bring their message to the Capitol. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. A lot going on in Springfield these days with the new governor and the legislature in session. Here to talk about it with me, Charlie Wheeler is back. He is director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, University of Illinois Springfield. Before that, longtime State House reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times and a budget expert. Welcome back, Charlie.
Always nice to be here, Bernie. Thank you.
And Hannah Meisel is here. She has worked at the State House and is still covering news of Illinois, now a reporter with WILL Public Radio in Urbana. Hannah, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, kind of a big deal in the last few days at the state Supreme Court downtown Springfield in their newly renovated building. We don't talk about the cost right here, I suppose, but I'm sure it's very nice. I did not go myself, but I saw some of it online, and I know it was on broadcast. So where are we? This is the plan that would save much money over many years. But many unions and retiree organizations say, no, the plan that was passed when Pat Quinn was still governor and signed into law is not legal. A judge in Sangamon County said it's not legal because it cuts back on future benefits, compounded annual 3% increases. Current employees would have to wait a little longer to retire, and cuts like that. But the argument from the groups that represent retirees or future retirees is that goes against our state constitution, which does not allow you to diminish promised pension benefits. So where are we, and what's it look like when you watch these arguments?
Well, I would say the one thing that can be said with absolute certainty, the hearing the other day was probably the first time in anyone's memory that there were actually lines to get into the Supreme Court.
It's been a while since there's been that interest, that's right.
But yeah, you laid it out pretty well. The retirees say that the guarantee in the Constitution that says pension benefits cannot be diminished or impaired means what it says, and that it's a pretty factual statement. It was put in the Constitution back in 1970 specifically to preclude what the legislature and Governor Quinn attempted to do with Senate Bill 1, the so-called pension reform package, which, as you said, it reduces future benefits for people. And the argument of the retirees and the current employees is you can't do that. The Constitution says no. The argument from the other side, from the people who are supporting the bill, the Solicitor General for the state, which argued the state's case, is that, well, nothing is absolute. Illinois is in such a horrible financial straits that the concern about how we're going to pay for important services trumps the guarantees that are in there for current and future retirees. The questioning from the court seemed to be more directed at Ms. Shapiro, the state's, what would you say, counsel?
Lawyer, lawyer for the state side, to try to uphold the law.
Yeah, and it was along the lines of, are you saying that the state has no recourse, that there's nothing else the state can do? I think it was Justice Thomas raised the issue. Here you are saying things are so terrible, yet at the same time, you let the tax increase roll back and gave up on billions of dollars of new revenue. I mean, what kind of an emergency is that?
For the first time, I calculated yesterday, and it was 463 days since the pension law initially passed and finally gets its day in Supreme Court. Now, of course, last fall, Sangamon County Judge John Bells declared it unconstitutional on its face, and he knew that it was going to the Supreme Court. But it was the first time that we heard from the state, not just police powers, but the nuance there. The state is arguing that it's not just it's not the words that matter in the pension protection clause that says, benefits shall not be diminished or impaired. Instead, she's arguing that it's a contractual agreement, and thus, those words don't matter as much as the contractual agreement.
Which can change.
Right, exactly.
In an emergency. They're saying we have to use our emergency police powers because the state's in such a bind.
Right,
Which is an interesting thing to argue.
She gave
Well, if I had to argue their case, I would try something like that too.
Yeah.
Well, she gave, some circumstances where she felt that it could be, the police powers could, be used, and she argues because it's a contract when there's an emergency, like the state's fiscal, crisis, call it a crisis or not. It's been going on for a while now, but, that it could be. And then, the other side fires back with, there has never been, police powers, sure, it can override regular legislation, but this is a part of the Constitution. These
Right.
are, and then the state fires back again that it's not really part of the Constitution if it's part of a contract. So is it or is it not?
Yeah, well, by the precedent that we've seen, this Supreme Court already said that when there was a state law that said state retirees who were promised that their insurance, with a certain number of years, I think 20 years, that their insurance, once retired, would be paid, their health insurance would continue to be paid entirely, that could not be rolled back either. And so the Supreme Court undid a law that saved the state a lot of money because people started paying premiums. Now that's not happening anymore. So the precedent seems to be, I think most court watchers are saying that, the retirees and union folks are going to win this. But I know that's difficult
and it's
to
interesting
predict.
Too, because the state's argument wasn't to uphold the constitutionality of this law right here and now. It was, please send it back to the circuit court to allow us to argue this police powers argument.
Yeah, but Judge Bells didn't seem to be open to much wiggle room back when he was hearing this case.
No, and I'm not sure why, because on the one hand, the state says, let's accelerate this case so we can get a decision before the legislative session is over. And then they come in and argue, well, let's get it back to the circuit court, where if it's in the circuit court, there's absolutely no way there'll be a circuit court ruling probably before the end of the session, and that will be appealed, whatever it is, and there'll be no way that will be adjudicated. So it
doesn't affect the state budget problem right now.
Yeah, it doesn't solve the problem.
One interesting thing, and I'm not certainly the first or only that noticed, but Bob Thomas, one of the Republican justices who was asking questions and being rather pointed, and well, why did you let the tax expire if you say this is now an emergency? Isn't that of your own making? Used to be the kicker for the Bears.
True.
so there's all kinds of ways you can use. There's all kinds of ways you can use the punt thing, but we'll see where that goes. Okay, that's obviously an interesting thing. What's happening with pensions, but the whole state budget is also in continual crisis, even without pension reform, which will stand or not. There's, I think, is it $1.6 billion a hole that's currently in the state budget that ends, the fiscal year that ends June 30th, and then, the Rauner budget plan for the next fiscal year, which starts July 1st, has many cuts in many programs. And so in the last few days, there were busloads of people brought in, a group called We Rise, but it was organized by Service Employees International Union. They represent a lot of people, home care workers and various groups. One of the active unions that at least works with people who work in programs that get state money. And they brought about 1,500 people in this combined group, and there were people sitting in front of the governor's office and filling the rotunda and walking over to the mansion and saying, these cuts are hurting people. I know there have been stories in newspapers from the State Journal Register to the Chicago Tribune and other places about, autism programs are being cut back, and 50,000 people with intellectual disabilities may not get the kind of help that they're now getting through state programs, so what will the families do? It's expected when you see that with cuts, but there's going to be a lot of this. I know Governor Rauner expected this. What effect does it have, Charlie, when groups of people come to the Capitol and say these things, when you also have this terrible budget problem and this whole that, you don't have the money?
Well, I think the impact of it is to keep it before the general public. And to make the general public realize it's not just that greedy state employee who sits on his can all day and does nothing and collects the big fat paycheck waiting for the even fatter pension check, but there are real people, vulnerable people in our society people who don't have the advantages maybe of having multi-mansions and billion-dollar incomes who depend on those services to be able to survive. And the cuts that are proposed, I've said this before, they're very draconian. It's a despicable plan in my judgment because it's going to hurt real people. And I think the message, the protesters and the people who've gone to editorial boards across the state, the people who've been at other rallies is, look, this is not some game that's being played. This is real people's lives at stake. And unless the state can fund these services for the least fortunate among us, people are going to really suffer. And so the question, I guess, is for someone like me who fortunately has a job. I don't have to worry. I don't think I'm autistic. I don't have to worry about autism services. But on the other hand, maybe my neighbor does. Maybe one of my family does. I have to be thinking beyond my own selfish interests, if you will, for what's good for the community as a whole. I think that's the message these folks are trying to get across.
The effect it has is, more on what's behind the scenes, the political calculus. When you have people coming from a certain district and they are, going to make appeals at a lawmaker's door and say that lawmaker is vulnerable in the next election, you'll either, have someone who is willing to make that vote or not willing to make that vote for, cutting services or, raising revenue. And then it's interesting, you asked what effect does it have? Well, on the governor, I read that a reporter yesterday caught him in the hallway and he asked, what do you think of all this? The 1,500 people that came to Springfield to basically, yell at you for your proposed budget. And he said, well, it looks like they're having fun.
Having fun on a beautiful day. I think Seth
and
Richardson,
the
our reporter,
I'm still not
through the program,
not convinced of is whether this is all part of a ploy by the governor to try and force the Democrats to make the first move on revenues, because everyone who looks at this seriously has said you can't solve it by cuts. You have to do some cutting, but you also have to come up with more money.
Right.
The governor's budget includes no new money, and so
Right.
is he trying to force the Democrats' hand and make the Democrats be the one who come up with some revenue, be it expanding the sales tax base, be it restoring the income tax rates to where they were? Or the frightening thing, and I hope I'm wrong, does he really think that these cuts are sort of just a bookkeeping thing, just an accounting thing?
Okay, well,
with no empathy for the people who are going to suffer.
Yeah, and again, we can't know exactly what anybody is thinking, but the negotiations, at least as reported in Capitol Facts and other places, for the current year's budget is to sweep various funds, possibly even including the road fund, which all of these funds that are for special purposes but have pots of money that can be used. In the past, legislatures have taken some money and with the promise that they'll be repaid, and I think what they want to do this year is take money and not repay it. But they maybe more than $1 billion or $1.5 billion might be taken from funds to get through this year, and then into next year there might be new revenue. I'm thinking, possibly Governor Rauner, because he ran on such an anti-tax platform, Illinois is taxed too much and our business climate is not good, that he probably wants to at least get through the first couple of months here and this session and this fiscal year, which ends at the end of June, without any tax increase, and then maybe he will agree to something for the next year. Does that sound feasible to?
Well, the thing that keeps sticking in my mind is that the idea of expanding the sales tax base was something that Rauner, the campaigner, talked about.
Right.
And now Rauner, the governor, is ignoring that. At one point, he raised the question of why don't we tax retirement income, like a lot of our neighbors do. And he suggested at one point, maybe we need to increase income tax rates and phase them down even below where they are now over a longer period. He, as a campaigner, he was a lot more moderate and not nearly as hardline on this stuff as he is now that he's governor.
But again, it could be a negotiating position for some kind of bargain to be made.
And that's what you don't really know. Right. And in the past, you always knew with governors, like when Jim Thompson proposed some of his draconian budgets, you knew it was a bargaining position because Thompson himself said as much.
When it comes to this year's budget, we still have 3.5 months left in this fiscal year, and we are running out of money. I think the first time the governor really addressed this, he said, well, the Pat Quinn administration should have told these programs to budget better, budget themselves better when we realized that, we were losing and there would be no income tax hike extension. As for this year, the governor has said repeatedly for the last month and a half, almost as soon as he got into office, these things began. Actually, side note, it's been, we tape on Thursday, and it's been 2 months exactly since the governor was sworn in. Almost since the day that the governor, took office, these budget problems have come to light. And he has repeatedly said that, he is working with the Democratic leadership to get this special authority to have these fund sweeps. He originally wanted $2 billion. Now it might look like 1.6, 1.4, maybe a little bit less. But he had repeatedly said that he is days away. He's days away. And then on Monday, Senate President John Cullerton spoke at the City Club of Chicago, and he said, I haven't, talked to the governor. I haven't met with him. It's another.
Did he say not at all?
I believe so. And it's another case of the governor conflating, someone with their staff, just like on election night, saying that
he'd been in touch that night.
He'd been in touch.
Yeah.
Not quite.
Well, I think what is on the table will probably turn out to be something that we've done kind of typically as long as I watch this stuff, and this goes back to, longer than I care to admit, it goes back to the 70s, where the legislature will say, okay, we're falling short in these areas. And there's kind of like two issues. The one issue is, have we given the agencies enough authority to spend to cover their costs? The second issue is, do we have the cash around to be able to cover this additional authority? And so, as Hannah said, taking money from these dedicated pots and putting it into the checkbook account would provide the cash, but then you also need to increase the spending authority for some of these lines. For example, subsidized daycare or prison salaries at Taylorville for one. I think Jacksonville is another prison, and there's maybe half a dozen prisons that are going to run out of money. Or for court reporters. So there's a line in the budget now that says, here's this money to be used to pay court reporters. Well, there's not enough money in that allocation, so they have to increase the spending authority to cover the costs, but then they also have to come up with the dollars in the checking account to cover those checks when they're written. So it's kind of a twofold thing, but as I say, this has been done in the past, where the legislature will say, take this money from this pot and use it for this purpose.
The difference is here, though, that the governor doesn't seem to want to pay these funds back.
Well, and that's not always been the case, that they have been paid back. As a matter of fact, if memory serves correctly, Rod Blagojevich swiped more than $1 billion from special funds his first year with no payback.
Okay.
His argument was, this is money that's sitting there, they don't really need it. And part of the reason that they didn't need it was because they increased the fees that paid into a lot of these funds, and they did not spend the additional money on what the funds were intended to fund, but instead they wanted there to be able to put it into the checkbook account.
As all of these negotiations are going on, and the budget is obviously a big thing, the governor has been traveling around. He was in Mattoon. He's been saying it in Springfield to groups including the asphalt pavement group of road builders. Continues to push what he calls, I think, empowerment zones, which are also known as right-to-work zones. This is on the backdrop of, right-to-work means you can't be forced to pay union dues even if you're in a bargaining unit if you don't want to join the union. Whereas, it's called fair share fees at the state. He's trying to withhold, those, and unions have sued. Scott Walker, who he talks a lot about as being the kind of guy he wants to be, who is the governor of Wisconsin, just got through the Republican legislature up there, made Wisconsin a right-to-work state, so nobody can be forced to pay union dues if they don't want to. And our governor continues to make the strong case in places that he goes. You should be able to decide on a local level through your city or county government, your local municipality, if you want to have that kind of empowerment for your workers. And he talks sarcastically, if you want your people to be forced to join a union and your teachers, that's okay. But if you want to compete with Indiana and Wisconsin, here's what you should do. Okay, we have a Democratic legislature, and so it seems like this philosophy is not going to take in Illinois. Is he wasting his breath or creating something to bargain with, or what? I think he believes in this.
Oh, I think he believes in it. I think he's got a pathological hatred of unions because organized labor stands against the kind of things that people in his prior life, the equity investors, try to do. Come in, take over a company, lay people off, cut people's wages. You can't do that if there's a union contract. And so he comes into the state. There's these union contracts. We actually have to pay decent wages to people on road projects. I don't know, maybe part of his grand design for prison reform is to have prisoners build the roads.
Well, he is saying on
like
road
in the
projects,
30s.
Prevailing wage says everybody has to be paid union wages on government projects in Illinois. He says it costs a
You could do more
25%
if you
premium.
If
you can
pay
bid lower.
people
If
less. Right, that's what I'm saying. If you put prison inmates there and you pay them 20 cents an hour, man, we'd have the best roads.
So do you
in
think
the
he has a
country.
chance, realistically, of getting this
No.
done in Illinois?
And one aside, you mentioned Scott Walker. Had the Rowners, Mr. and Mrs. Rowner, lived in Wisconsin and paid their income tax in Wisconsin at income tax rates in Wisconsin, which are graduated, they would have paid last year something like close to $2 million more in state income taxes.
on his
So
on his earnings last year of $61 million.
Yeah, and so that's this Wisconsin where everything is such a dream.
Gotcha.
It's a question of why he keeps, he must know that this is not going to fly with the supermajority Democratic legislature. But it's a question of who he is, delivering this message to. Is it the people on, the very far right? Some people have speculated that maybe now that he's got the governor's office, maybe he wants a national stage. But it seems to me that he wants to keep his message of a competitive Illinois going, and he'll do whatever he can to keep it going. It's also easy to, demonize public workers. When other more realistic, competitive sort of solutions like reducing workers' comp or adjusting, other things like that.
Unemployment insurance and
right. That's
tort
a
reform.
little bit more
He talks
tort
about
reform.
those. He talks about those and wants those.
He does, but it's not as easy to grasp as the picture of someone in a union who sits all day and doesn't collects a paycheck.
Speaking of easy to grasp, there seems to be a congressman who represents part of Springfield and Peoria, Aaron Schock. This is the federal side of the show today, or at least part of it. He continues to be in kind of a lot of trouble since a Washington Post reporter a month ago or so reported that kind of the bright red and with lots of pictures remodeling of his Washington office, which at least someone in the office said was to look like Downton Abbey. Since then, many news organizations have been looking into Schock's spending. Lynn Sweet of the Sun-Times, one of your former colleagues, found that he took 10 staffers to like a 4-day trip to New York City, and she claimed in her story that some of them didn't have that much to do official, and he said, oh, sure, they were working, but we don't know exactly how. She also found that he had a charter flight that he took from Washington to Peoria. Well, they found out that weekend, which he was having it wait in Peoria anyway, there was a Bears game in Chicago, so they flew to Chicago, and then Politico found that the expense for that, the extra $3,000 for that flight to Chicago, I believe, was listed as software when it was actually the software company's plane. So there was a question on legality of inaccurate reporting on campaign funds or on some funds for that. I hope I got all those right, but there's been continuing problems with Aaron Schock, and CNN's done a big story in the last couple of days. We're following him around Peoria. He's certainly, after in his 4th term in Congress, he's getting a lot of different kind of publicity than he was used to. Where do we go from here? What does this mean? Is he in serious trouble as far as staying in office?
I would say that this should be a wake-up call for Congressman Schock, and it should alert him to the fact that because at one point he was the youngest congressperson, he was kind of a rock star. That's okay, but you don't want to live that lifestyle, because as they say, we'll just play in Peoria and kind of jet setting around at taxpayers' expense and then having to reimburse them and say, well, I'm not sure really if I broke the law.
Yeah,
I
he
don't
did.
think
He
so.
did
I'm not
pay
an
back
attorney."
personal money was $40,000 he paid just for the office remodel.
Yeah.
Out of his own bank account.
But what he needs, I think, is his dad to take him by the ear and say, now look, Aaron, grow up. You're not a frat boy anymore. Behave like a congressman.
He held maybe 1 or 2 news conferences last week, and he said, I apologize, but I'm not going to resign. And then the conservative publication National Review was like, they called for him to resign. When the National Review, calls one of their own Republicans, to resign for fiscal irresponsibility. I don't know. I follow him on Instagram, where he famously, displays all of his fun lifestyle, and it has been markedly toned down lately, I would say.
I think it's...
Well, and I think, did you report it, Bernie? There's someone who's talking about running against him already in the Republican primary?
Our paper carried it, but it was either the Peoria or Lee papers, but it's someone who lives in Bloomington who had tried to run for state representative or state legislature before, and one of Aaron Schock's operatives had filed an objection that knocked that person off the ballot for inadequate signatures, but now they want to get signatures. And this is a person who's a conservative Republican, sounds like, said that he wants to bring more gospel to Washington, et cetera. So it would be possibly coming from the right. I don't know, given that the district is overwhelmingly Republican, if it's possible for the Democrats to look at this and say, if he is primaried or not, we would have a chance. In past years, there's been some chance, but I don't know if Democrats would invest a lot there.
I would think the way the district is drawn, that if the Congressman Schock survives a primary challenge, if there is one, he would not be high on the Democrats' target list. I would think there are other districts in Illinois that will get higher attention from the Democrats than the one here in Central Illinois.
Right. I'll just mention as we kind of run that U.S. Senator Mark Kirk, who of course has recovered from a stroke and says he is fully functioning, other than he talks a little slower than he used to and walks a little slower than he used to, is in full campaign mode. And Illinois Democratic Congresspeople Robin Kelly, Tammy Duckworth, Bill Foster, and Sherry Bustos, who's father Gene Callahan, late Gene Callahan from Springfield. She's in East Moline. Those are 4 people who are thinking about a possible run against Mark Kirk. So a lot to watch, even beyond the legislature and the budget problems. With that, Charlie Wheeler, Hannah Meisel, thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.